Today, I've got my first ever guest of the series, Cedric Chin, joining us. And this is the Collective Knowledge series. The goal of the series is to discover and share the insights of professionals that are passionate about improving how they learn. And through the conversation, I hope to understand the guests' learning process, their tools and views on knowledge management, and how this shapes their worldviews. And that's why I'm really excited to have Cedric here tonight. And really, we're going to try to address this fundamental question. How can we best organize knowledge individually and collectively? To tell you a bit about Cedric, Cedric writes Commonplace. He's the founder of Commonplace, a blog that's about better business and career decision making, has a very active community over there. He was previously also the country manager, leading a team of engineers in a startup in Vietnam. And Cedric and I first crossed paths while I was working at a data analytics SaaS startup. Worked quite a fair bit with Cedric, and I've always appreciated his thinking and the way he approaches things. So very excited to pick his brain today. So thank you for joining me, Cedric.
Thank you.
All right, so maybe you can just share a little bit about, about yourself and what you're working on right now.
Sure. So Commonplace is the name of the blog. It's at commoncog.com/blog. And the reason it's at commoncog.com/blog is because CommonCog was the software that I was trying to build. And now actually I'm starting to try to build. I started maybe about like the last 6 months, last quarter of last year. So that's when I started building it in earnest. And the blog originally started actually as a way to learn content marketing. And that's actually how Evan and I, yeah, exactly. Evan and I met because I helped Holistics with content marketing for 2.5 years, actually. After I got somewhat good at content marketing with the blog. So the blog has done pretty well, and it actually now roughly, I think in the second half of the pandemic in 2020, business mentor sort of like said, like, dude, like, I get a lot of value reading your blog, and you should figure out a way to monetize it, because then it gives you more ability, more options to do whatever you want on your entrepreneurship journey. And he was right. And so I started the membership program in the end of 2020. It's grown since then. And basically that covers most of my expenses. I mean, it's grown so much. It's bizarre. If you told me that like a blog would be able to cover all the company expenses and my living expenses, so that it allows me to go and build software, I would say like that's pretty ridiculous, because who ever heard of like, well, I guess there are some bloggers out there who can make money, right, using their blog, but I've always regarded those as outliers. And I completely missed the wave of Substack writers. So there was a rise of Substack over the course of 2020, 2021, where independent content producers were able to charge subscription fees and make a decent living, just writing newsletters about topics that people find interesting. And Commonplace definitely falls into that category. I think a lot of maybe half of the audience now is finance-oriented people, surprising to me. And then there's a good mix of tech people and programmers, data folk, but also like entrepreneurs, right? And the topics that I grapple with in Commonplace, it originally started as a career-focused blog, because I had all these ideas about careers that I never really articulated. And a lot of my friends, when they were talking to me, they found it helpful. And when I say career, I mean specifically, how do you navigate a career when you're not trying to climb a career corporate ladder, right? Or work for a big company. So like I've always wanted to start a company. Sorry, excuse me. I've always wanted to start a company. And so that meant like grappling with some of these ideas that I think most of my friends did not, because they were more open to like working for a big company. And there the paths are more clear cut. Lost in a field versus climbing a corporate ladder or like following a train tracks. And so some of the sort of ways of thinking about your career and navigating your career in this sort of free form way, I think I had better developed ideas about those than about like sort of many of my friends. And many people found that useful, especially because like as anybody who has been around a bit in their careers would know that careers are not that well structured. You do weird things. You get bored of your job, and then you switch industries, or you take some time off in a startup. I know I'm rambling a bit, but let me sort of like bring it in.
Yeah, no, let's keep going.
So the blog started off like talking about career ideas, but eventually it became a way for me to process a lot of my business experiences when I was running the software engineering side of this Singaporean company. But the engineering office was in Vietnam, and over the course of my time there, we bootstrapped from basically $0 in product revenue. We were a consulting company, which means that we were over glorified outsourcing shop, right? We built apps for clients. And we grew from nothing to 4.5 million over the course of like 2.5 years. And this was like after 1 year of like, the very beginning was like 1 year lost in the wilderness trying to figure out like product. And so we successfully did that from consulting to product. And we, along the course of that journey, I grappled with a lot of things that I didn't understand. And the blog became sort of this way to sort of process some of the things that I was seeing. Like I was dealing with a lot of like Chinese businessmen who are uneducated, which you see a lot in Southeast Asia. They were very good at business. Like they were ridiculously good at business, and they were superstitious, and they had never had any formal education. And they were so good at business, and I couldn't figure that out. I was like, why are you so good at business? What is this thing, right? And then there was also like the limits of frameworks. So every time you read business books or business blogs or startup playbooks, right, go to market handbooks, you have this idea that like this is the way that things get done, right, in the startup world. And then you go and implement it, and you realize that, hey, it doesn't actually map, or like our industry is like it's weird, it's unique to us, right? And in our particular case, the thing that really made a huge impact on me was we made and sold point of sale systems to mostly Singaporean businesses, right? And the point of sale business, you just do a cursory Google search. It's an incredibly competitive field. There are large companies. There are also a lot of like local companies selling to these local small SMEs, right? And when we talk to VCs, right, they will say like, oh, this is a incredibly crowded business. There's no way you're gonna make it big. There's no way you're gonna make a lot of money. And we were making a lot of money. And so like for I think 1 year when at the start of that journey, right, when it was very clear we were making in like a month what we used to make in a quarter or like half a year. I can't remember what it was, but it was like a ridiculous like order magnitude from consulting fees that we were charging, right? And then my boss and I were like, what are we missing? Why are we making so much money? It doesn't make sense. And that's sort of like that experience when we finally figured out like what was causing it, right? We eventually realized that the market was shaped in a certain way, and there was no amount of frameworks, no amount of like business books that could tell you like this is actually what's going on. You have to go out to the uncertainty and grapple with it and seek out information and piece together this idea of like what's really going on in the industry. So a lot of my blog now grapples with decision making under uncertainty, which happens to be a topic that a lot of people, if you're in business or you're investing, you will eventually grapple with this. My blog tends to not appeal to people who are new to business or novices. You need to have at least 1 or 2 experiences in your career where you think the world is a certain structure, or like you think the frameworks are the best thing, and then you hit the limits of frameworks, and you realize that like, hey, no, like there's more to this game than just taking frameworks and applying it. There are all these edge cases. If you have that experience, or you have dealt with like true uncertainty in your career and your life, you will be attracted to what I write about in Commonplace. And I think that helps to explain why a lot of the audience recently has been more like hedge fund managers and finance people. Anyway, so that's the very long, incredibly convoluted explanation of like, why is it that I am writing a blog, and and maybe why we're talking, right, about collective knowledge.
Yeah, no, I think what you've just gone through there, that experience that informed how you're thinking about things, that was really informative for me to hear about, to understand that that's how it started, this whole process for you. And there's just so many angles that we can look into right now from what you just shared there. Can you hear the air conditioning here? It's not too loud, is it?
It's fine.
Okay, perfect. Because then that probably starts me off with my first question based on what you just shared, that whole situation where basically how do you think about learning in such conditions of uncertainty, or like you said, frameworks fail you, and basically you're just thrown into a situation where you're trying to find some stable reference point or some certainty, but it's very hard to find that. How do you go about approaching this learning journey?
No, I'm laughing also because I know you have first-hand experience with this because of our experience in holistics together, right? Like we were grappling with a market that we didn't really understand, right? Or like there are people think they understand, but then there's always the local unique situation that your company finds yourself in, and then there's always like quirks that really matter to you for execution, but maybe don't matter to like the people who give you advice, like VCs or some analysts in Gartner, right? So yeah, I grapple with that a lot, and to my surprise, I found that, oh, rather not to my surprise, I already suspected this somewhat. Um, um, Frameworks are really the marker of a novice or a journeyman, a journeyman. I think journeyman is like the term where you're like an intermediate skill level, right? Not a master, not a senior journeyman, like a journeyman. So if you're a novice or you're intermediate skill level, you think in terms of frameworks. But really the frameworks are just ways for the masters to, well, they're like good frameworks and they're shitty frameworks. Like shitty frameworks are like probably some guy wants to have like a book publishing deal, so then he comes up with some framework, sells it as a business book, and then it goes viral. But then there's also good frameworks and by master practitioners, and those frameworks, they're just the tip of the iceberg, right? The master practitioner cannot communicate the full thing that is in their head that tells them what to do, right? So they try to distill it into a framework, and then they try to communicate that to you, and then it is a very sort of like lousy compressed version of what actually lives in their heads. And so like a smart operator, especially if you're dealing with somebody, you know that this is the fact of life, right? You have met a few master operators or master practitioners, and you can see that the way that they're operating and thinking about your specific problem, the way they're applying your expertise, is not actually captured fully in the framework that they articulate to you when you ask how they do what they do. So then you begin to sort of like think like, hey, you know, there's something in their head that can't be easily articulated. That is the valuable thing. So I know I'm sort of talking around your original question, which is like, how do you deal with this pure uncertainty in the market when there's no framework? And I actually have a blog post that some people find quite powerful, which is like reality without frameworks, right? And it's like this idea of like, when you're looking at a situation first, don't try to apply a framework, because when you apply a framework, it forces you into some sort of narrow tunnel vision where you're forced to sort of like, the framework shapes the perception where you notice certain things prescribed by the framework and you miss certain things, right? And sometimes the framework might not be the right framework to look at. So you miss certain cues because you're sort of blinkered by the framework. So I have this thing where I say like, what I've learned is that you go in and you say you don't know. Even if you do think you know, right? You sort of like, I have no preconceptions. I'm just going to take a look at the entire environment as it is and be completely overwhelmed with the information and the chaos and the lack of patterns. And the reason why you have to be comfortable with that is that the reason why frameworks are so popular is because frameworks really help to give meaning and shape to the chaos of reality. And so therefore the novice tends to like sort of cling to it like a lifeboat, right? To like a, what do you call it? A life jacket. And then after you sort of steal in this chaos, only then do you try to apply certain lenses. And so like, I find that the more masterful practitioners, even if they immediately know what to do, they do some pattern matching, right? They are also able to sort of like take a step back and go like, what's going on here? With far more ease and facility than a novice or an intermediate practitioner who will sort of cling very tightly to the framework. Say, no, it must be like this. It must be like this. It must be like this because Geoffrey Moore wrote in Crossing the Chasm that it's like this, you know? And then you're like, yeah, well, Geoffrey Moore speaks from a certain context and the ideas are very valuable and right, but the way they are expressed might be very different, might be very incredibly different depending on your industry and your specific context, right? So context does matter, right? So yes, like sort of hold on to Geoffrey Moore's lens, but it's a lens, temporarily remove it and take a look at all the data. I'm being very abstract here, I realize, which is maybe not that useful. But do you want to sort of go down this path more, or like, are there any other questions? Or maybe you want to go into a detailed example?
I think the interesting part of what you just shared, right, when you talk about, yes, clinging to frameworks becomes a little limiting because it's nearly like a sort of, if you will, confirmation bias of sorts. I have a framework, I have a lens,
Yeah.
I'm going to look for things that help to fit in that worldview,
Yeah.
and you might be missing extra information. But okay, so if we talk about pattern matching and being able to understand, okay, let's phrase it as, if you're trying to piece together a new field, you're trying to understand what's going on. You're trying to gather and collect information, sort knowledge out, prioritize things, organize and manage your collections of knowledge about something new. Surely there has to be something in how somebody can effectively do that and handle that, right? So of course you don't have to be married to frameworks, but how do you actually become a better learner? How do you throw yourself into a new uncertain environment, look out for things that's important, pick things apart, figure out what do I need to know to get good in this field?
Okay, I see where you're going. I'm so glad I asked you to like ask a follow-up question instead of like going down my rabbit hole. I see where you're going with this. I like to think that I'm better at this than many people. I mean, you be the judge of that, right? Like you saw me sort of level up in marketing, time together. So I'll give you the answer that I gave somebody in holistics. This was after like you left, right? But I only figured this out after you left, and I was sort of like trying to figure out like the marketing sort of how to think about how to level up when marketing and apply that with the interface with sales, because marketing and sales, like the interface tends to be a bit more complicated. I need to quickly figure out like what is the state of the art in that particular field, right? So when I'm trying to do that, I think the key sort of like trick that I use is you want to get at the meta very quickly. And the meta is like this.
Exactly.
It's the meta game, right? Wait, so there's two pieces to this. One is you want to figure out what the meta game is, and the meta game is like the edge of the field where like you want to go where the experts are currently figuring out the limits, not because you can copy them, but because you want to know what the covered ground is. So you want to have a rough idea, like, okay, here is the current best known practices around like how to sales and marketing work together, or like here's the current best known practices about doing content marketing, and it has changed from the last 5 years. 5 years ago it was different. 10 years ago, it was different still, because like the environment changes, right? The competitive landscape changes, right? So that's like one half of what I do. I quickly go and find the best practitioners in the field that people sort of commonly say are the best practitioners. And then I listen to them, and then I try to piece together as I'm listening to them. And I specifically say listen instead of blog posts, because listen, if you go find podcasts, so obviously here one precondition for this method is that the domain that you're trying to level up in has people who go on podcasts and give interviews. And the reason why podcasts are really important is because during podcasts, especially when a practitioner speaks to another practitioner, they are likely to drop sort of like offhand comments that they have not rehearsed that reveal something about the field. Right? Like, for example, you hear two marketing people talking and you say, oh, back in the day, like, it was so easy to play the Google game. The AdWords game was like, you throw in $1, you get $6 back. That kind of return has never been seen ever since. And so now the game is much harder. And so like, in your head, like, okay, there's this cluster of experts who came up in that environment, were used to those kind of returns, and then now they had to adapt to that. And that's valuable knowledge, because now there's covered ground. Now that maybe it's not a good idea to try to specialize in AdWords, right? Sorry, I'm recovering from COVID, so it's okay, it's fine. So that's one element of it, which is like you go listen to them to figure out where the edge of the meta is, and then you try to. And then the other thing that I do is I go pick out landmark books, and landmark books are books that have. My definition of a landmark book is the conversation is like X, right? Before the landmark book was published, and then after the landmark book was published, the practices and the conversation in that field change completely. So example of this would be in sales.
A paradigm shift of sorts.
Yes, correct. So an example of this in sales would be, I think the most recent one was the Challenger sale. Before the Challenger sale, the last landmark book was God, I can't remember what is it called. I think it's called Spin Selling. Yeah, Spin Selling. So all the sales books before Spin Selling were talking from a sort of Zig Ziglar motivational focus on a close sort of sale, right? Tactics oriented around like sort of door-to-door salesman and insurance agents, right? Small dollar sum sales. And then spin selling sort of like broke that paradigm and said, like, dude, guys, like if you're doing enterprise sale, you're doing large 5-figure dollar deals, right? The way you sell is completely different. And spin selling, like you can tell from like the way people talk about it, from sort of like you follow the sales frameworks, they completely changed after spin selling came out, which was I think 1990. I can't remember when exactly. It's either 87 or like early 90s. Probably 87. Everything changed, and then like challenger sale, and then like predictable revenue came out, I'd say maybe late 2000s. Again, I can't remember the date. I can probably pull it up, but it's in a blog post somewhere. And then predictable revenue sort of like, sorry again, was this Salesforce paradigm of like basically figuring out a new way of doing outbound sales reach. And the innovation there was sort of like spreading the people, the hunters from the what do you call it? I can't remember his term for it. It was like hunters and farmers, I think it was. And then after that was the challenger sale, right? So like once you have sort of mapped out this, it's like, okay, these are the landmark books. I can go read the landmark books. I know that every development in between is probably like small iterations, so I can like ignore it. Or if you give me a new framework, I can like look at the date and go like, okay, this is probably influenced by spin selling, right? And there are other like complex sales approaches that are not worth mentioning because, in my opinion, spin selling sort of laid the foundation. They are just like tweaks, and you can very quickly figure out what the tweaks are and why. So once you got that map, right, and it's only like 4 or 5 books. Usually for content marketing, again, it's like an equivalent set. I can give you another equivalent set. You read those, you map out the timeline in your head. You figure out immediately the names, you go look for the podcast, you listen to them now, many years after the original landmark books were published. They will usually drop hints, right? Like, oh, in a couple of years, like I was talking to this guy, he figured out that this variant that actually works well, and then now like most of Silicon Valley use it, and you're like, oh, I need to go check out this thing, right? And then you go and check out that thing. So that's figuring out the meta. And it's really quite a small investment in the grand scheme of things. I know a lot of people say like 5 books, holy shit, that's a lot. But if you think about it, you're taking 5 books that compress 2 decades, right, of experimentation and found knowledge and covered ground into just like 5 books, however long it takes you to read 5 books. It happens that I read very quickly, or I'm quite a good reader because I do a lot of it, so it's easy for me. But even if you're a bad reader, right, 5 books could take you like 5 months, 1 book a month, right? That's 5 months in your entire career, and you immediately sort of like, okay, I know covered ground now. I'm better than like maybe 80% of the people in my field who are, just learning whatever is being taught to them, or whatever they see on blog posts on LinkedIn, which is probably like some, you don't even know whether it's like a fad or what it's built on, what the influences are. Anyway, so that's one half of the approach, the meta. Sorry. The other half of the approach is, I find that when people try to learn a new field, and this is especially true when it comes to marketing, right? Because everybody always thinks that they know marketing. Marketing is easy. They've been marketed to their entire lives. They think they know how marketing works, especially if you're in sales, right? Sales is actually very, very similar to marketing, right? Because you need to understand the customer's psyche. You need to be able to get under their skin. You need to, figure out like what they're looking for. So there's like this element of psychology involved. Product is also very similar to marketing. So people in product think that they know how to do marketing, right? And so what I find very infuriating, and what I've learned not to do, is that when you come in with a background in sales or product, and you try to learn marketing. I'm using marketing as a specific example because this is like what I'm very familiar with. Also because it's a very pernicious example. You immediately try to map what the expert is saying, whoever the expert is, April Dunford, Seth Godin, you try to map it to something that you understand. And there is a lot in marketing that maps to something that you understand if your background is in sales or if your background is in product. Like empathy for the customer, the buyer's journey, right? All these things. These do map to the sales funnel. These do map to like sort of consumer psychology, user psychology that you're taught to do in design interviews in product, right? And then you completely miss out on what makes good marketers. Because you're so busy trying to map it to some concept that you already have, you miss out on how the other, like the actual marketer that you're learning from sees the world. And this is hugely wasteful because I keep talking to people who are like, oh, I understand marketing. And okay, like, tell me what you understand. And then they tell me something about the buyer's journey. And like the surface level, all the keywords, like they are correct, right? But I can tell that they do not understand what it really implies based on their actions. I'll give you an example, right? Like, so like a lot of people, they think that they understand the buyer's journey, right? They don't understand the implications of the buyer's journey. Like, if you're producing a piece of content, where in the funnel should it be, right? What kind of content should it be? Does it make sense for it to be there? Are there certain things that you shouldn't even try to put into marketing because it's not marketing's place, because it's so far down the buyer's funnel, sorry, the buyer's journey, that it actually should be sales material instead, right? So they can talk to you about like the buyer's journey, right? And the psychological states that people are in, awareness and awareness, evaluation, all these pieces, but then they don't have like this sort of deep internalized understanding of what this means in terms of like marketing tactics, or like where should we go after the funnel. And these are things that if you are so trapped in your existing sort of paradigms about product or about sales, right, you will miss when the marketing person says these things and then there are implications and there's a certain worldview communicated. Because you're not listening carefully enough, you don't realize that actually the way that they look is subtly different from product. And so what I did sorry again, what I did in the months, this was after you had left, I forced people working on the marketing team in Holistics to explicitly say, are you wearing your marketing hat or your product hat right now? And you're not allowed to wear both. If you wear your marketing hat, you're not allowed to talk about product changes or product roadmap. Your job is to communicate and sell and market the product as it is right now, not what it is going to be 6 months from now. So when you listen to the customer, right, you're not allowed to think of new features. You're only allowed to think in terms of like psychology and copy and worldview and positioning, right? You're not allowed to talk about, to think in terms of product words, which is like features and user journeys, and and it's very easy to mix the two up because they're so similar, right? And then so I will force people like, you're wearing your product hat now or you're wearing your marketing hat now. If you're wearing your marketing hat now, I don't want to hear about your onboarding flow. Right? Because like that's not our job, and the worldview and frameworks, the way you to think about it is completely different. So as a result of this, like I found that like the acceleration of learning became much faster, because they would now understand like, okay, if I'm listening to a talk by April Danford, I need to put on my marketer hat. I need to be very careful attention to the way that she approaches these ideas around understanding, customer psychology, understanding the ideal customer, that is different from the way that I, as a product person, think about the ideal user or the user psychology in the various states of the onboarding process, right? Only then, if I let go of my existing sort of like understanding, right, in the product field, can I actually internalize how these experts see the world. And that's a huge deal.
Yeah, wow, that's a very powerful idea. It kind of reminds me of that quote, right? Is it to a guy with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail?
I mean, no, that's the problem with frameworks, right? In general. I'll tell you a funny story. So I was talking to this guy called John Cutler, who is a product expert. He works for Amplitude, and his job is basically to go and talk to many product teams and help them with their help them become better product teams, because then Amplitude wins, they win. And so he's seen hundreds of product teams. And he said to me, like, one way that I can immediately tell if the person is an experienced product person or not is if they talk in terms of frameworks. Because the really good product people, it's not that they don't do the things in the frameworks. They do them, but they don't talk about them like in terms of frameworks. It's just things that they do, right? Whereas the person who is a novice will like always call like, oh, this framework or that North Star metric framework, that framework. And immediately I'll be like, oh, okay, like you sweet summer child, you don't actually know how to do product. You're just sort of like glomming onto all these frameworks. So I was like, holy shit, okay, that's awesome. Like somebody else is telling me, it's confirming my biases against the frameworks. Or like, frameworks have their place, but they're not the thing. They're the vehicle that the experts try to use to communicate the real thing that's in their head. And the quicker you understand that, the quicker you understand that the framework is just the the captured thing that exists in their head, and it's what's in their head that actually
It's
matters.
the articulation.
Yes,
of it. It's
yes,
crystallized,
yes.
but it might not be. Yeah,
Yes, it's not the full thing. It's a lousy compressed version of the thing. That's the only way that they can communicate it, because words are limited.
I think you're alluding to something you talked about in your blog about tacit knowledge, but I'm not going to go down that path yet. Because I think there is something here that was quite, that I would love to unpack, and it's going to be quite a big question, so approach it however you wish. You brought up this point about surrendering your preconceptions in order to have that acceleration of learning.
Temporarily, yeah.
Right? And then I have a question for two kinds of people. One is a person that wants to get really good in their specific field. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's product management, maybe it's sales, versus somebody who needs to be more of a generalist, and in the situation described, a product person needing to understand marketing, or maybe a salesperson trying to understand product and all that. Are those two scenarios very different? The person who's trying to go deep into their area versus the person that's trying to get a broader feel of things. How are the ways of learning those two things completely? There's a different meta for both of them.
No, that's a really good question. So it's a really good question. Okay, so here we get into somewhat speculative territory. I do have ideas about this, but they're not backed. Like everything that I just said earlier, I'm quite sure is true, because I have not only verified it with other practitioners and experts, I've also verified it through my own personal practice. And I mean, this whole thing, like where whatever you believe is true should lead to effective action, right? So I can speak with some confidence over there because I have already applied it and I've seen the results and it seems to work. And I'm going to keep applying it again and again until I find it to fail, at which point I would probably have to update, right? So I'm quite confident with everything I just said in the previous sort of like segment. This is more speculative. This is more, I'm not sure if this is true, but I will say this. So my hypothesis is that when you climb high enough in one skill tree to be good enough, so I think I'm pretty good at writing, right? I think I'm much further.
I can vouch for that.
I think I'm much further up in the writing skill tree than most people, to the point where I can see what other writers have that I do not. I can see the skill tree. I can see the shape of the skill. I know what sub skills exist that if you're a novice or you're a lousy writer, you would not actually be able to sort of you will not be able to articulate, much less notice. Like I can break down for you any writer that I've read enough of. I can sort of break down what makes the writer special, what he's able to do that I'm not, he or she is able to do that I'm not, right? And I can tell you what's hard about what they do. And as a result of being this high up in one particular skill tree, because I've spent so many years sort of like getting good at it, I have become more attuned to the skill trees in other skill trees. So I can tell you, for instance, right, that I am nowhere near the stage of the skill tree where I can see the nuances and the shapes of other experts or rather other good people's skill. Let me paraphrase. Let me restate this. You know how like when you're watching sport, if you don't play the sport, you don't see the nuances and how you don't know how good they are. Like a person who doesn't play tennis, right? You watch Federer and you go like, oh, he looks very nice, but you don't understand like how bloody hard it is to play tennis the way Federer does. Federer makes tennis look like ballet, right? Anyway, do you play tennis? I don't know.
A little bit.
Yeah, so you probably have more of an appreciation for like what Nadal and Federer are able to do that's so difficult, right? The nuances of the skill in a way that I do not. In the same way that when I watch a judo match, I tell somewhat, but I know that I am not at the level of my skill in judo to be at the same level as my level of skill in writing, because I know that I cannot tell the nuances of the skill yet. of like, say, Shohei Ono, like, why is he so undefeatable? I don't understand that. I don't understand how he makes fighting judo, like, fighting all these world-class opponents look like playing with kids. I don't know why, which tells me that I'm not at that skill level yet in judo to be able to sort of like disambiguate, like, here are the various sub-skills. Okay. Now that's a very valuable idea. The reason it's a very valuable idea is because it allows me to sort of like quickly, like a sniff test, when you wet your finger and you put it in the air, like how good are you actually at that particular sub skill? And recently, I'm starting to feel like I'm starting to get it when it comes to business. I'm starting to see things that novices don't in business, right? Similarly, in marketing, I'm starting to get at a little, right? In a way that, very sadly, even though judo is a passion of mine, I don't in judo. So I'm able to sort of look at certain marketers and go like, okay, I think I can see the shape of their ability, and I can see all the various ways that I cannot do what they do, and therefore I know in my head the sub skills that I need to go chase to get good at it. And I'll give you an example, right? So like for marketing, there is the shape of the skill in my head right now, and I could be wrong. Again, a expert marketer listening to this will probably find like various modifications, and I'm open to that because I still regard myself as like maybe a B- in marketing. There is a spectrum in marketing where you are either very performance oriented or you are very brand oriented. Is this the word that I think that phrase, performance and brand, right? So, and there's this tension in marketing, and all of marketing like falls even in like little things like, should we have a pop-up in our web page? There's a tension there between brand and performance, right? So certain people are really good at performance, and these are very numbers driven. They run ads, they can do A/B testing, they figure out like what the return on investment or the return on whatever dollar spend it is, right? And then there's more brand where you sort of understand the consumer psychology, and you're able to create campaigns like Estee Lauder, or I guess Shopee is pretty good at this. I think they have a mix of both. The really, really good marketers have both, right? But then there's like a huge gradation of skill in both levels. And I'm actually not that aware of what exists in the performance marketing side. But in terms of like the brand side, at least on the content side, I can sort of see certain things now that I say, okay, this person is pretty good at breaking down like what's necessary to create a consistent voice. And they know tactically and operationally how to achieve that, right? And I can't do it yet, but I'm able to see it, which tells me that my skill is starting to get there, right? So where I'm going with this is that this ability to sort of see the skill tree and the shape of the skill is very helpful regardless of whether you want to quickly level up, right? In the case of, in my case, I need to quickly level up in marketing, because when I left my previous company to go start my own entrepreneurship journey, I did a skill assessment, self-assessment, and I was like, the way I'm most likely going to fail is that I'm not good at sales or marketing. I need to be good at least one, right? And then I went off and did Commonplace, and it's like a systematic sort of like multi-year process to try to get good at marketing. So it's useful because then you quickly level up there. It's also useful if you want to climb, because once you know the levels of the skill tree, at least like, for example, in writing, right? I know how to get good at certain things. The question is like, do I want to put in the effort to do it? Because I know now, not only do I know like the shape of the skill tree, but I also know like how much work it takes, and I know the number of years it takes to get to that level. And then like, I like, okay, I'm going to work on this sub skill. And don't get me wrong, the sub skills that if you ask me to describe these writing sub skills, they don't sound like, you won't see them in blog posts. Or they are not easily articulatable, right? I was reading a writer's sort of analysis of Paul Graham, right? And I was like, this is not actually what makes Paul Graham good. And the fact that the writer didn't know tells me something about that writer's skill. Paul Graham's ability is really to distill an observation down to like a very concise articulation. And during the articulation of that observation, he's able to use certain words that are very simple, but then when you put it together, they're like beautiful. I guess like the wonderful example of that would be like relentlessly resourceful, right? Which is this wonderful articulation, two words. They mean like, they're very simple words, but then they put together and then they express such huge vastness of meaning that capture this observed property that if you're in startups, you know when somebody is relentlessly resourceful. You can recognize it, right? So that is the heart of Paul Graham's skill. It's this mix of like observation and be able to articulate with like this wonderful almost like when you look at the words, you're like, yeah, this is the inevitable expression of this phenomenon that he has observed. Anyway, so like, see, I just needed to use like a whole number of sentences to describe this sub-skill. And this is a sub-skill that I think I can improve in. I know how to improve in it. But it's going to take years to be as good as Paul Graham is, right? But I can articulate what makes him good that's different from my skill. And that is, I think, one of the markers of like, if you're, you're chasing expertise and you reach a certain level.
Right.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Somewhat. Let me see if I'm getting you right.
Yeah.
Basically, are you suggesting here that by having gone deep in one area, one skill, maybe it could be judo, it could be writing, it could be something.
Yes. Anything.
You'll be better able to recognize
yes
what you need
yes
to improve in another field, which
yes.
then leads me to perhaps a troubling notion that I'm trying to grapple with here then, which is how do you effectively transfer knowledge then? Because just now you mentioned two ways, right? You said there's usually a set of books that capture all the key ideas compressed into maybe 5 books in a certain area, say marketing, and also podcasts. That's one way they can really hear 2 practitioners trade and share ideas and then really grasp the nuggets from what they discuss. But then what does that mean for, the regular blog articles that you find online? Is transfer of knowledge even possible in a effective way, or is it that the people who have gone deep will get to know more, and the people who are new to something, they're all going to suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect? They're all going to think they know something, but they really don't.
Right. No, guys, I realized that I should sort of wrap up my previous section with a more concise articulation of what I was trying to say. So what I was trying to say is, yes, climbing high enough in one skill tree gives you the ability to recognize the state of skill in when you're trying to learn a new skill. This is not a new observation. I think, I can't remember who it was. Maybe it's Peter Thiel, who like sort of said, like, if you're a chess grandmaster, you have like sort of like, if you've excelled in one aspect of your life, it's likely you're going to excel in other aspects of your life. And he was probably referring to something else like innate talent or intelligence or something like that. But the thing that
reminds me of what the Shopify CEO said. I think he'll hire startup, StarCraft professionals, because he also believes that notion that pick up really quickly.
So the way that I'm coming at this is a bit more it's a slightly different, which is that I agree with the Shopify CEO and what he said, Toby Luki. But the reason why and why I think this effect exists is slightly different than perhaps intelligence or aptitude or like proof of hard work, which is that when I talk to people who have hit certain skill levels, like the minimum bar, I call it like the minimum bar, where like beyond that you can see the shape of the skill, and then like maybe you choose not to go and chase it because it takes too much effort and you're interested in other things, like with me and writing, right? Because I seriously wanted to be a novelist when I was a kid growing up. But there is a point where you reach that and then you see the full skill tree above you, and you see all like the stars and like exactly why they're so good, and you know like a rough idea of what it takes to get there. There is this point, right? And every time I've talked to somebody who has reached this point, it could be a classical musician who has spent like maybe 7-8 years practicing. It could be like a badminton player who played for the state, right? But the standard of, I was a state player for judo, but the standard for judo is much lower than the standard for badminton in Malaysia, as you probably know. So they are much higher on the skill tree, right? Every time I talk to somebody like that, right, what they know is that they know that that there is a point beyond which you can see all of that. They also know that anybody who is above that point, right, when they talk to each other, they say certain things that you do not understand. If you want proof, if you want an example of this, right, you go find this a YouTube video by Wired where Jacob Collier, I think, talks to Herbie Hancock. And they are both jazz musicians. And the setup of the video is like, I think Jacob Collier sort of explains music to a kid, and then a teenager, and then a college student of music, and then like a professional musician, and then Herbie Hancock, which is like a multi-Grammy award winning musician. And Jacob Collier himself has won a Grammy award, right? When Jacob Collier and Herbie Hancock start talking to each other, you do not understand what they're talking about. which tells you that you have not reached that level in the skill tree where you can understand these two practitioners talking. Because if you have, you should be able to understand what they're saying. You do not understand what they're saying. You will not. You can go and watch it. I think everything Jacob Collier makes sense, right? Makes sense until he hits Herbie Hancock, and then you're like, holy shit, what are you guys talking about? You know, they're talking about the game, the real details of the game. And so when you know that exists, that shape of the skill tree exists, you learn to listen for it whenever you hear two practitioners talking to each other. You learn to very carefully pick out, okay, wait, this is a very subtle quirk that a practitioner makes to another practitioner, and then the other practitioner sort of laughs knowingly, and it whoosh over my head, right? Which tells me that I need to figure out what that is, and I need to learn it. I need to get to the point where I understand that. And so that's what I think you learn and you internalize once you've gone high enough in any skill tree. This is true whether you are high, like I know a woman who is a coach for the women's team in Ultimate Frisbee in Singapore. She sees this in the game of Frisbee. So she knows when she's like doing marketing that there is this same skill tree. There's always levels to it, right? And so she's watching out to it. And I think I had a friend who told me that he had a new hire who was a classically trained musician for many years, and he switched to tech, right? Did a boot camp. And he said that she seemed to level up and figure things out much faster than everyone else. And she zoomed in on like the higher levels of skill and taste in programming than all the other people that he met who had come from boot camps. And he suspected that transfer was going on. Transfer in this very specific way.
Gotcha. Wow. Okay. So it sounds like there's really no avoiding the hard work.
Well, but, I think you can get good at listening, at hearing when a practitioner is making it's not very hard to notice that they're saying things you don't understand, right? And then making it your goal, your personal goal to say, I'm going to go and figure out how to get to the point where I understand what they're saying to each other. I think that's not too hard. Yeah, I really think that's not too hard. Once you get an idea of like what it sounds like, you very quickly learn to glom onto it. And this is where like marketing is particularly nice, because a lot of marketing podcasts are marketers talking to other marketers, because marketers like to talk, right? And they like to interview each other, right? So that's beautiful. Yeah.
I'll switch gears a little bit to a topic that's quite dear to my heart right now, which is trying to figure out how to take what you just described and figure out if there's ways to scale that approach digitally. Because for me, I would like to believe that there are a lot of people who are genuinely interested to better themselves, improve themselves, and they're scouring the internet for information, for ways to get better, to improve. And what's your take on how can we facilitate these transfers to happen more quickly at scale, to help people to get to that state of hitting that point in the skill tree where they can see the rest of this map of concepts and ideas, or what's necessary to get better? Can we accelerate that process at scale for people?
So I think that, so I can address this question with like, there's actually a huge branch of the human factors research crowd, mostly funded by the military, that specialize in exactly this question, but it's not really technologically scalable, because a lot of their methods are, I mean, it is technologically scalable, but first you need to learn their methods of how to extract expertise from the heads of people, right? And it doesn't actually get to the what I just described to you about the whole skill tree thing. So the skill tree thing is actually something that I have not written about, because I don't know how to articulate it. I don't know if it's true. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's true from people who are experts, but I don't actually know confidently that it is something that exists, right? I could give you, so I will say this, anybody who's listening to this, you should go to my blog and you should go to the Tacit Knowledge series and look into it. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm not going to go into it now, because I don't think this is what you want, right? It's not scalable because it requires you to learn how to learn their methods for extracting tacit knowledge, and then you need to learn their methods for designing training programs, which are scalable. But then like learning these two things, it's not really a technology thing, right? It's like you need to learn it, and it probably would take 1 or 2 years of your life. And I happen to be interested in it, so I am trying to learn it, but it's not a scalable thing, right? And the output of that process, like once I learn that, I should be able to design training programs, the simulation programs, and digital tutors, which they have done for the military, right? That will be scalable and that will allow like the acceleration of expertise. But that's probably not what you're asking for. So those of you who are interested, you should go to my blog and read that series, Tacit Knowledge Series, Common Cog. Type that into Google, you should find it. So I think the direction that I would go into, that I think would be more useful to you and helpful to people watching this, at least in the context of like what you're doing with Centrally. Did I pronounce that correctly? Centrally.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So did you see the most recent blog post about note taking?
Oh, your post on note taking?
Yeah.
Briefly, I haven't gone through it yet, but yeah, I saw that.
I think that's a lot more applicable to what you're doing and a lot more scalable. So I will articulate the theory. This will take a bit of time because it's a really big theory, and I'm still sort of digging into the implementations of the theory. So how I got into this is there's this book called Accelerated Expertise, which is a summary of the best known techniques for accelerating expertise, commissioned by the US Department of Defense and written by a whole bunch of like the who's who of expertise researchers, including one of the founders of the entire field, Paul Feltovich, who was a contemporary of Erickson and helped create the deliberate practice paradigm, right? So that book, incredible book, incredibly dense book, incredibly difficult to read. At the very end of the book, they say, look, every accelerated training program that we know of and we have helped create actually sort of sits on top of two learning theories, cognitive transformation theory and cognitive flexibility theory. And these theories are not theories that you would normally hear of because these theories are not theories that are actually applicable to the real world. Not applicable to classroom research. So a lot of the research that you read online, they are actually optimized for classroom learning environments, which is quite useless to you and me if we are in a real world operating environment, or we are practitioners trying to get good at our careers and out some skill that is useful to business, right? Or vocational education, if you will. A lot of research that is done and therefore has a lot of attention tends to be optimized for test taking or like student performance on tests, which we don't really care about, and the military does not care about. The military does not give a shit about like how well you do on tests. The military cares about you doing well on the battlefield and not dying. So the theories are a bit unusual and they're worth looking into. We're not the theory that I want to talk about today with regard to this question that you've asked, how to scale this, is called cognitive flexibility theory, which ironically was originally developed for more mainstream education, but it was built out of work, understanding, and trying to accelerate medical expertise. So think the level of the doctor's education where the doctor is in the hospital treating actual patients, not the level where they're still sort of like medical students in a lecture theater, right? The other theory, cognitive transformation theory, is also very interesting. It's about how people learn from real world experiences. And that theory, to sort of whet your appetite, but we're not going to talk about it, explains why some people can become masters through trial and error and some people cannot. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about cognitive flexibility theory, CFT. So CFT is about accelerating, it was built off work on accelerating medical expertise. And there are 4 big ideas that we need to talk about. So he has 2 major claims, but before we get to the major claims, we need to talk about 2 big ideas that we need to articulate in order to set up for the claims. So I'll go in order. The first idea, the first claim that CFT makes. So CFT is a learning theory, a theory about adaptive expertise, which is a very specific subfield of expertise research that asks how are experts able to deal with novelty. Because that is one of the elements of expertise. If you go back to Dreyfus and Dreyfus, like that's one of the articulations of like what expertise is. In addition to pattern matching and doing well, they're able to deal with novelty. And all the classical theories of expertise research do not deal with this question, right? Like if you look at the chunking or theories by de Groot, when they look at chess players, where they say that chess players see chunks, and then when they see a certain board format, they're able to unfold the chunks to figure out like what needs to be done. That explains pattern matching parts of expertise, but it doesn't explain handling novelty. So CFT is a theory about novelty. The first big idea is that CFT grapples with ill-structured domains. It's specifically about ill-structured domains. And an ill-structured domain is a domain where there are concepts, right? But the way those concepts show up in practice are incredibly variable. And medicine is an ill-structured domain. So medicine has concepts like a heart attack, right? Heart attack, something you can learn in a textbook with a mechanism of action. But if you are a doctor and you're trying to diagnose a heart attack, right? Knowing the concept in a textbook is quite useless to you because the way the heart attack shows up is incredibly variable. It depends on the age of the patient, the complications that the patient has, the previous diseases the patient has, the race of the patient, the gender of the patient, right? And it can show up in a gajillion different ways, right? Like, okay, not a gajillion, but like many different ways. So like we think of heart attacks like, oh, and then you fall over, right? But some heart attacks start out presenting as indigestion. They look like indigestion at first. And some heart attacks can last days, right? So it's not that easy to sort of like go like, oh, here's a heart attack. Let me teach you the concept in a textbook and then like you can do it. So it's an ill-structured, so the formal definition of ill-structured domain is like, there are concepts, but the way concepts are instantiated are hugely variable for the same nominal type. And this should sound familiar to you because business is like this, right? Business is 100% ill-structured domain. You may have competitive advantages, right? Like brand or scale advantages, but the way it looks is dependent on the industry, dependent on the competitive environment in which the competitive advantage was created, dependent on a huge number of things, right? Okay, so like, that's big idea number one. We are talking about ill-structured domains, right? Which is not school for the most part. Big idea number two, when you're dealing with ill-structured domains, right? Cases are as important, if not more important than concepts. And why is this the case, right? So like, this is actually quite a subtle argument. And so like, we need to talk a bit about it a bit more. I think in school, we are taught to that concepts are more important than cases. So the example I like to give is solving quadratic equations in secondary school in math. We are taught the technique to solve the quadratic equation. We're given one or two examples and then we throw it away, right? We know that the examples are not important. It's like the steps, the formula to solve the quadratic equations is important. And we internalize this. And I find that people who either are from STEM backgrounds, they're software engineers like me, or they're engineers, or they have gone through management consulting, they tend to think like this as well. The concepts are more important, the cases are throwaway. But if you are in an ill-structured domain, right, what this theory, what these researchers found is that like good experts in ill-structured domains, they're able to, they don't reason from the concept or the principles, or the first principles, right? Because it's too variable. What they do is they think in terms of like what cases they've seen, and then they combine fragments from cases that they've seen to be able to reason about like what they're looking at. Because you cannot, the backing for this research is that they find that junior doctors cannot go from concept or mechanism of disease to what do you call it, symptoms in the real world. They also cannot go from observed symptoms all the way back up to like the concept. It's just too difficult. It's too variable, right? And then they find that expert doctors don't do that, right? Expert doctors actually just reason from fragments of previous cases that they've seen. So this brings us to the two main concepts that the two main claims of the theory. The two main claims is that experts in ill-structured domains are able to do what they're able to do because, first of all, they reason from by analogy to previous cases that they've seen, fragments of previous cases that they've seen, instead of concepts. Now, they may articulate the concept. You may ask them what's competitive advantage, they give you a definition, they give you a neat thing, they give you a framework. But the way it's represented in their heads is a cluster of cases that they've seen in all the various ways, different various ways that the principle expresses itself in the real world. That's how they're able to operate, right? The second claim that the theory makes is then that these experts, when you sort of study them, you realize that they all share like a certain worldview, which is that in an ill-structured domain, there is no one cause, there's no one lens, there's no one framework. There are multiple valid causes, multiple multiple plausible causes, multiple plausible lenses of looking at it, multiple frameworks. And they are not beholden to any one. They're able to sort of like, okay, we may never really know the full set of like causes for these symptoms or like this business problem, strategy problem, but we have multiple lenses and they're all like equally valid because they all give me information, right? And one of the strong examples of this is that like most of us, we tend to reduce down to a prototype, right? So in our heads, we have a prototype of an ideal heart attack. We imagine a person clutching their chest and falling to the ground. Expert doctors do not have this. Expert doctors instead have a cluster of prototypes in their heads of what a heart attack might look like. And they know to sort of like look at each of them. Okay, so why did I do this whole long setup? I did this whole long setup because the recommendation that these researchers then did is like, how do you use this to teach, right? And the answer is when you present a concept, like say scale advantages, right? You give the student an example, a case, and it must be a case with full story, full context. That means like, an example might be, when Texas Instruments in the 70s, Morris Chang was put in there, and then Morris Chang was like, oh, like it's really stupid that we charge full prices. So why don't we charge at a loss for chips so that there's a huge amount of volume, we capture a huge amount of market share, and then our volume goes up so that we can climb up the manufacturing learning curve and increase yields. And then we maintain this chip production for a very long time to recoup all our costs. But we can do that now because we now have the majority of the market because of our low initial costs. So this is an example of scale, a competitive advantage of scale in semiconductors. But then after that, the students go like, oh, okay, that's a great example, right? And then you give them another example that's completely different. So like you give an example of Morris Chang setting up TSMC, which is a very different environment when he had left Texas Instruments. He left because he couldn't get to the CEO role, possibly because of racism. Went and set up TSMC. Different environment because at that point, it was like 2 decades later, everybody had caught onto this strategy. Everybody was using the strategy that Morris Chang invented, right? How is he able to compete? So struggles for many years, and then eventually realizes that Apple comes to them and says like, hey, we want to make chips. And then Morris goes like, holy shit, we are a pure play foundry. We can actually like ride this wave of mobile to like huge volumes, which then means that we can climb up the learning curve and be much better at manufacturing chips in this ARM, for this mobile world, low power chipset, better than everybody else in the world. We're just gonna run with that and ride that, right? Because it's the same principle, but it's a very different environment now. And our competitive advantage is that we are like counterposition as this pure play foundry where we don't design our own chips, we work with you. And then we try to get as much volume as possible. So we climb up the manufacturing learning curve, and then we have much better scale advantages than everyone else. Now, different expression because different time, different competitive set, different dynamics, right? They're not TI, right? It's completely funded by the Taiwanese government initially, right? So you give them a concept, and then you give them an example, and you give them a second example that's very different from the first, and you give them a third example that's very different from the first two, like Netflix, right? Netflix has scale advantages because it's the largest install base amongst all the streaming providers, and this allows them to have a lower per unit cost to invest in content. So as a result, they ramped up their junk bonds, like they issued a huge amount of debt. And this was very risky, and everybody thought that they were crazy. But at this point now, they have scale advantages because all that money went into content production. And so now they have they're sitting on top of this huge amount of IP, and that they can justify spending on because they are at the pole position with the largest market share amongst all the streaming providers. Again, a very different example, right? So you give the student the authors recommend 10 to 20 different instantiations of the concept with full detail, because in the real world you cannot separate the detail from like the instantiation of the concept, and the student immediately becomes like aware that, hey, no, this is not that simple, right? If I want to be a business operator who can use the competitive advantage of scale economies, I now sit with a much better understanding that the way this concept is instantiated and used is very variable depending on the situation and the capital available to you and the competitive environment. And then they're able to work like experts in such domains, because now with like 10 or 20 cases in their heads, they're able to sort of like draw fragments from them. So when they're actually, it's time for them to implement a competitive advantage from scale economy advantage, they see the opportunity, they know how it actually looks like and how it has actually been instantiated in the past. Anyway, so that's an incredibly long explanation for like one way that you can scale this, right? Which is that you teach students by giving them the concept and then like telling them go and go and search for other cases, and then link the concept, like put it in a collection. And when you're looking for cases, you want to look for cases that look very different from all the cases that you currently know. You focus on the differences because then you have a much larger set of like concept instantiations with much more variety, which then makes you more effective because you're able to like, combine fragments from all these previous cases.
Got it. I mean, what you articulated sounds to me like business schools are on the right track with how they keep pushing case studies.
But the thing is, they don't tell you that so I talked to like a person who he runs an expert network, and he's talked to some of the people in Harvard Business School on how they write their cases, right? And he said that like they don't actually think of cases like that. They think of cases as expressions or abstract concepts. And when they write the case, they usually write with an eye to the abstract concept, right? And they don't tell you as a student, like, look, the right approach to reading the case is you're not there to generalize abstract principles because you can't. You're there to see it as instantiations of concepts, but then you don't try to reduce. You shouldn't reduce to principles. You should just hold the case in your head in all its detailed glory with all the nuance and the mess. With the understanding that in the future, your brain will be able to draw fragments when it's time to like implement. You will reason like, oh, this reminds me of that time when so-and-so did this, right? Which, by the way, is how Charlie Munger tends to reason. So this is one in my sort of essay I sort of wrote. When I read this theory, this explained to me one of the longest mysteries that I've had, which is like, if first principles thinking is the ultimate arbiter of like good thinking, right? The ultimate gold standard, right? Why is it that Charlie Munger seems to reason so much from analogy? He likes to say things like, oh, this reminds me of the time when, Coke and Pepsi were in this price war, and then like Pepsi did this, and then eventually this happened. And you're like, I see the point that you're making, but why are you telling me the story of Coke and Pepsi? Why aren't you just making just stating the concept, the point that you wanted to make, which is that if you have like substitutable products, it's actually okay. It's actually very effective to go into a price war, but it might not turn out well for you because it didn't work out well for Pepsi, right? But it turned out that like you can't articulate just the abstract concept because it really depends on the actual example in which the concept came about. And by telling you the analogy, which Munger does, you are able to sort of like reason more critically about it. Like, does it really apply? Does it not? Usually some parts apply, some parts not, but you have to sort of like reason a bit more critically about it to be able to use it. Articulating the concept, the abstract principle, makes it sound like it's universally applicable, which is not the case in business. As you know, I know, we know.
Interesting though, with what you just shared, it sounds to me like there's a trade-off going on here, right? And I'll be curious to get your take on this. The trade-off between reading widely and getting that diversity of cases versus trying to be targeted in identifying what is most important to know. How do you strike that balance? How do you navigate that? Perhaps they're not even mutually exclusive.
Yeah, perhaps they're not mutually exclusive. Like, the reason I'm interested in a lot of these business things is because like I see Commonplace as this temporary thing where you're along for the ride as I'm trying to improve my business expertise. But at some point, I'm going to actually go and implement the business expertise, like actually go and execute, right? And pretty much the cash flow from the blog is meant to like fund the software or like whatever other business activities that I'm doing. And when you see it in that light, right? Like, okay, so if this is the way that experts in the field are able to reason about business moves, then obviously the right thing to do is to go and get as much cases as possible. Maybe not that many, not as much as, I mean, if you think about it, right, reading books just to collect the cases so you can construct fragments and know what has come before It's not very expensive, right? Books don't take that long to read. You just have to like not watch Netflix. And I guess, yeah, you're right in the sense that like you need to focus on a few things, right, to be good at business, and or whatever it is you want to get good at. And if the thing that you're looking for is not ill-structured, then you should just like go and study the concept, or like, you know, go and find someone who's good at it and then learn from them, right? But in general, to be effective at your role, you tend to need a couple of like, even in marketing, to sort of understand like what a good marketing campaign looks like. That looks very different in different companies and different industries, right? So it's probably worth it to go collect a few samples. And I think most of us know to do this, right? We do this by asking our friends or good practitioners that we meet in conferences for stories about what they've done in their company. And then we go like, oh, so I know that like Julian from so-and-so company did it this way. And I know that Sarah from so-and-so company did it that way. And then we collect it and we hold it in our head. So when it's time, you're like, you know, this sounds like what Julian did. I think we can try it. We can give it a try, right? So this theory merely argues that experts do this, and the reason they're experts is because they have a much larger case in their heads, case library in their heads, and therefore the pedagogical recommendation, which is something that I think Centrally can do, that, you know, any in my blog post I wrote, like any note-taking app with backlinking capabilities can do, is that you can go and find what do you call it, cases, and rapidly build up this case library in your head, which then means that you can accelerate your expertise, because you don't have to be like the expert where you have to wait along and spend many years of experience to collect the cases that then make up your case library in your head.
Makes sense. And that leads me to my next question then, would be, you've consumed so much knowledge and information. What is your process like? What do you use to document? How do you organize these ideas? What are some of the tools you're using? How do you approach this?
So I use one of the after reading the CFT body of research, right, I realized that I need to create a CFT learning system. So I probably need to go find a note-taking app, maybe Obsidian, which I already have installed. It's just that I don't use it as systematically. Now I have a reason for like how to use it and why, a learning theory. So I should probably go and get it done. But the way I do it is actually very slapdash, right? So sorry. Every non-fiction idea book. So I split books, I categorize books into 3 buckets, right? There's narrative, there is there is non-fiction idea, there is non-fiction narrative. I categorize books into three buckets for non-fiction books. So there is narrative, again, non-fiction, because fiction is also narrative, right? But it's fiction. Non-fiction narrative, which is like biographies or histories. There's non-fiction idea books, which is like, you know, Atomic Habits by James Clear. And then there is, and I call these branch books, especially if they just express one idea. I think I've not read Atomic Habits, so I don't actually know if it's a branch or tree. But a good example of a branch book would be, I guess, Never Split the Difference. Is a good branch book. Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely is another branch book where it's just expressing like one idea. And then there's 3 books, right, which is like it explains the first principles of an entire domain, like High Output Management, or Principles by Ray Dalio, or Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat for cooking, that sort of distills all of cooking down to just 4 principles, right? So branch book, and then tree book, and then like narrative. All narrative books, fiction and non-fiction, get read on my Kindle, and I don't really highlight when it comes to fiction, because I think stories, they stick with your brain a lot easier, and I usually read it to wind down. Non-fiction idea books I highlight within iBooks. So all non-fiction idea books, be it tree or branch, I read it in iBooks, which is automatically synced amongst all my Mac devices, and I highlight and and I make annotations at the very last annotation of every chapter, which means like literally on the very last page of every chapter, I will make a rubbish annotation, literally the last page of every chapter. And that annotation, I will summarize that chapter. And then what allows that, and the summary doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be incredibly well written and comprehensive. I could just like make a bunch of like notes, dash point form of like what I found notable about that chapter, was the main thrust of the argument of the chapter and what was interesting. And the reason why I do that is because later on when I come back to the book, right, I can jump to the end of every chapter and immediately see what I found notable, and then quickly skim through all the annotations and all the highlights. So that sort of like gives me a hit note for every chapter. So a hit note is a lawyer term. When lawyers read cases, they don't want to reread the case. So after they read the case, they tend to write a hit note at the very top that summarizes the case so that they can refer to the hit note instead of rereading the entire case, right? And I do that for chapters, and for some books, I do that for the entire book as well. I like have a separate document that I write the entire thing. Academic papers, there's the same thing. There's highlights, and then like in the abstract, I would have a highlight in the abstract, which is usually the first part of the paper that has the overall summary of the paper. So, and for PDFs, which includes papers, I use an app called Documents on my my iPad, which I can then export with all the annotations. And so that explains like how I'm able to sort of compress and still be able to refer to a huge amount of like books that I've read or papers that I've read. They're all in sort of, papers are all in Dropbox. Well, actually both books and papers are in Dropbox, but the books are, if they're in iBooks, they're already synced across every Apple device that I have. And then a lot of my notes are actually rubbish. They are sort of throwaway. I don't really look at them. If it's valuable enough these days, if it's valuable enough, it tends to be summarized and synthesized in a blog post format on Commonplace. And then that becomes like the way that I go and read my synthesized thoughts, right? And I think that's it. For podcasts, I'm not happy with the system as well. I tend to use Overcast, and then I clip a certain like the maximum 1 minute 30-second clips of like important fragments, and then I sort of remember it. And to be honest, a great deal of this is in my head, right? So I don't actually need a secondary. Like it's both partly in the annotations, but also partly in my head. And the reason for that is because at any given time, I have like a handful of questions that I'm actively interested in and investigating. And sometimes the evidence for like the answer to it emerges out of nowhere. So like the answer to like, why does Charlie Munger reason by analogy is something that I've been wondering for like 3 years now. And only recently it's sort of resolved, right? Other questions that I'm sort of interested in is like, how, for the companies that grew without external capital, how did they actually do it? What are the ways, and like go look for as many stories as possible. Another question that I've been investigating for maybe 5-6 years is that why are most of the large companies in Asia conglomerates, right? And they are like multi-business, multi-industry conglomerates. What happened in the West that made them anti-conglomerates, right? It's the point where they have the anti-co. So anyway, my point is that these questions are like organizing mechanisms for the information that I seek. So I'm not reading with no purpose. Usually I have a specific reason that I'm reading a book, specific theme that I'm investigating. I'm not sort of like reading for like, oh, look, this is an interesting story about like, sometimes I do, don't get me wrong, for fun, right? To relax, right? Like reading Elon Musk's biography was like that, for example. I was not very interested in Elon Musk, but like fun biography and very cool story. But generally, when I read something, it tends to be for a distinct purpose. Blog posts are the same thing. Yeah.
And is that a very conscious process for you? You have this question in mind, and when you read that, you document what actually is relevant to this question. Do you organize it that way, or?
It's more like everything I read, I tend to. Feynman does this as well. I mean, Feynman talks about like how he has like the 10 most important questions in his head, right? And every time he sees a new piece of information, he asks himself, is this relevant to one of my 10 questions? 10 open questions physics. I don't. I mean, I do something very similar. I've talked to a number of people who are who write with the same level of rigor that I do. And they seem to have a very similar sort of like approach as well. Researchers as well seem to think like this as well. Intellectually curious people, I think if you're rigorous enough about the way you investigate things, you tend to eventually stumble into this, because there's like certain questions that have a grip on you, right? And you're like, how, right? So yeah. So anyway, when I look at a new piece of information, like my brain automatically goes like, is this relevant? Usually it's not even a conscious process, right? It's very immediate. It's like, so this is why manga reasons by analogy. Yeah, exactly.
And is retrieving these notions ever a challenge for you? Or what?
No, because if you have a burning question, it's always like sort of at the back of your head, right? Like you could put me in a beach, and eventually if I'm staring out there and I'm not present in the moment, like my brain will take one of these questions and like like why
Interesting. I'm just trying to imagine your process right now with all these different annotations, these summaries floating all around in Dropbox and all these places, and then the organizing questions in your mind that you're trying to then connect all these dots together. It seems like a lot going on.
Most of it happens in my head, but I'm fully aware.
And then you synthesize it when you write it, right, on the blogs.
Yeah. Well, no. So I synthesize it. A lot of the synthesis actually happens. Ideally, it happens before I write. And the way it happens is through conversation. So the reason why I could distill CFT down to like the 4 big ideas is because I had like 20 different conversations over the course of January, where I was trying to articulate in the best possible form, right? The best, most smooth, most easily digestible form, because the research literature was vast, and I think I had read like 3 or 4 different papers and like 2 to 3 different like precursor works, and each of these papers were incredibly dense, and they called out to like various other like bodies of literature, which I then skimmed. I didn't know how to articulate CFT, right? And talking to people like clarified my thoughts, because then I would see where people were confused. I would not be very happy when like I can tell that the way that I'm explaining things are not very clear. And so like what I'm trying to say is that well, 2 things. First of all, like you synthesize by explaining, and then when you write, that's like sort of the ultimate arbiter, like the ultimate standard for like clarity, right? Because you cannot lie to yourself. There are tricks, but as a writer, if you're trying to like use tricks to cover up holes in your thinking. And I don't get me wrong, I do that sometimes in Common Cog, but mostly I don't. Mostly I'm not happy if the question is important enough. The other thing to note is that I do a lot of this in my head, but I know from talking, again, because I talk to some of these people who do something very similar, they tell me that once you have kids, right? Once you get married and you have kids, this is impossible. And so you need a system to do this for you, more externalized thinking and less in your head. And I believe that. I truly do believe that kids take up a huge amount of your time and therefore your cognition. And I think whatever I do is not tenable long term, right? Unless I don't have kids. Yeah.
Right. So if you have kids, then you definitely need to start externalizing all that stuff.
Yeah, I need to work on it now, right? Yeah. So I mean, if you look at all these people who I think are similar, and then they have kids, and then they tell you something, right? It's usually quite wise to like heed their warning.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Cedric, I think it's been fantastic. Everything you've shared, all the ideas, the ground we've covered. I'd like to sort of wrap it up with maybe a question to you, and for you to sort of approach however you will. One of the ideas that I've been exploring together with my team is really around how can we try to map out some form of a collective mental model, some sort of knowledge graph that's overlaid onto a social network. And what would your thoughts be around this notion of, can we actually try to, externalize our own map of concepts of the world and integrate it with other people, and how what comes to mind when you think about that?
So I know, I know this dream is a huge one in the tool for thought space. I also know that there are some precursor works. So like Wikipedia is like the ultimate example, right? But that's because it's taking a form that is well known, the encyclopedia, and just making it hyperlinkable and user generated. And I think Wikipedia has done a lot of good for the world, right? So then the question is like, how do you do this better? I think doing a case, so CFT was really notable to me because it was the first time somebody had articulated like how a case library could actually help. You know, of course, you must tell the student, the people reading the case library, that like, hey, the way to use this is to understand that you're collecting fragments. Don't try to reduce this to abstract principles. And then there's a few other like things which you can go read my essay to sort of see like the tips on how to make such a graph of cases more useful. And they purposely say backlinked, note-taking graph. And I think that's the biggest way that you can do it. I am very skeptical of this idea that you can create a knowledge graph of mental models, of collective mental models. And the reason for that is because mental models are not explicatable. So let me be more precise. The military has spent a huge amount of money with the researchers in the naturalistic decision making that specialize in exactly this, because the military wants to be able to extract this tacit models of expertise from the heads of its soldiers, so that it can then train newer soldiers without actually sending them to the battlefield and like learning it through blood, right, and death, right? And so the best, and you would think that they are very motivated. They have a huge amount of money. They've thrown millions at this. There are some really very smart researchers who have worked on this problem. They've been doing this for 30 years. So you would think that they are furthest along amongst everybody, right? And one of the things that I'm trying to do and that I've been telling my friends in the Tool for Thought space is, please pay attention to this, right? It doesn't matter. I don't, whatever you come up with, I guarantee you the military probably has thought of it and has tried to put into practice, because they care a lot more than you do and they have a lot more money than you do, right? And what they found is that the best that you can do is you extract the mental models of expertise from the heads of these people, you put it into a the ability, the technique to do that is cognitive task analysis, by the way, at CTA. You put that into like there's a format, they have a number of formats of like how to collect this research, right? I think it's like, it's basically qualitative research, and a lot of the techniques are borrowed from like standard qualitative research organization methods. But that is not the result of the CTA, is not the thing that gets used by the military, because that's only useful to the organizational psychologists who did the extraction. How they implement and make sure that the tacit knowledge is communicated and lives inside the organization is they then turn it into training simulations. So the Marines at this point have a library of a huge number of, they call it tactical decision games. Oh, I think there's another term for it, but like TDG is definitely one of them, tactical decision games, where there are scenarios extracted from the heads of actual Marines, or synthetic scenarios designed with the help of expert Marines who have come back from battle, from actual deployments. And then those tactical decision games are then used to train and help newer. And usually the way it's done is like, I give you the tactical decision point one. I give you a scenario. What do you do? Or like, what is the most important area to take control of? Right, the bridge, the hill, and then you answer, and then we will review to you the expert's answer. So that's like one very scalable way. A more loose, less scalable but equally rich way is to have an actual expert practitioner in the room where they're doing this, and then everybody gives the answers, and then the expert practitioner articulates their answer. Or sometimes the Marines can have like two expert practitioners, experienced commanders in the room, and then they might give different answers, and then they debate, and then novices watching get a lot of information out of it. Now that is the gold standard for where the state of the art is right now, right? And the reason is very obvious why, right? If you extract the tacit mental model into something explicated and written down, stored in some database. The problem is and they have tested this, they've tried this. Nobody goes and retrieves and reads it. They don't. It's too busy. It's not built into their what kind of Marine will go and read up the results of a CTA, right? They're too busy. No, you need to turn it into something live. And they have successfully used this not only in Marines in military context, but also in industry context. So like one of the stories in Accelerated Expertise is a story of an electric company where they had expert electricians who retired. And then when a car crashed into a electric pole in New York, and there was like 5 generations of systems on that one pole that broke. No amount of the current electricians, technicians, engineers could like figure out how to get it to work. So they had to call an old person who had already retired for like maybe like 5 years, right, to come back and say, oh, okay, because I was here for most of it for the 5 decades where they slowly added new and new systems. Here's how you fix it, right? And then the electric company was incredibly scared, and then they called in some of these NDM researchers to do the tacit knowledge extraction, and then how they made sure that it lived on in the organization so that these people can retire and they can pass on without worrying that the knowledge dies with them, right? Is they turn it into simulations. They turn it into training programs that all the members of the actual technicians of this particular organization then had to run through as part of their job requirements. And that's how they make sure that the knowledge continues to live. And it becomes very easy to update this because then you just, if things change, you just do another extraction, you create a new set of simulations, you add that to the library of simulations that all trainees must go through, and then the knowledge continues to live, right? So this extraction thing has been done in I think it was the 80s or the 90s, the idea of like extracting it into a library, a knowledge base that everybody can search. And then the reason it failed is because nobody searches for anything in the knowledge base. So this is the current state of the art that the military knows and the military uses.
I think what you shared there, it's so interesting, right? That it's one thing to extract the knowledge, but
Yes.
unless you're able to package it, make it experiential,
Yes.
it's not going to stick.
Yes.
People are not going to retrieve
Yes.
either.
Yes.
And that's really the trick.
Yes, the real trick is making it live. So you can extract the tacit mental model, but then the creation, the passing on of that mental model to other people, right, requires some sort of like, it's not written, it's usually some sort of simulation or some sort of activity. I think the craziest idea, I know we're hitting up on time. The craziest example of this story is, and I talked to one of the researchers who worked on this, is the story of the IED detection, right? Where they had some soldiers who could recognize IEDs. These are roadside bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And the military wanted to know how these soldiers were able to recognize when the possible IED was down the road, and they managed to successfully extract the mental model, right? The tacit mental model of expertise from their heads. The reason why they had a bad feeling, like don't go down that road, there's probably a bomb. So they successfully extracted it. But then the way that they taught this to the new recruits who were going to be sent was they didn't give them a lecture. They didn't write it in like a bunch of case studies. No, what they did was they designed a computer game where the novices had to play as the terrorists. Had to play as the insurgents to set up the IEDs, because that captured the true nuance of what the actual soldiers were doing, which is that the expert soldiers who were able to have a bad feeling were putting themselves in the insurgents' shoes. So they taught this and communicated this mental model by forcing all the people who were going to be deployed in Afghanistan or Iraq to play this computer game, like a couple of rounds of it, just to get the mental model of how the insurgent taught and all the constraints they operated under when they were emplacing an IED, right? So like, yes, you can extract, but then like, how do you communicate? That's the problem. How do you construct the mental model in the heads of the novices?
Absolutely. Oh, Cedric, thanks so much, man. I think we could keep going on this.
Yeah,
There's
we
a lot
could.
we can be exploring. But once again, I want to just thank you so much for coming and being my first ever guest. And yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more with you. Maybe another follow-up session, and we can unpack a few more of these ideas.
All right.
Okay.
It's a pleasure on my end as well. Thank you so much.